So welcome back after a very short lunch break. Well, short lunch break for us. I hope you've already had some lunch. It's a great pleasure to welcome back Jaron Viëtor. He has been a close neighbor of the Hub, he and his company, for ever since the Hub has been here. So welcome back to him. He's from a company called DDVTech, and they have a product called MistServer. And he will educate us how to make sense of a fragmented OTT delivery landscape. So I shall hand over to Jaron.
All right. Hello, everyone. Well, as Ian just introduced, I'm going to talk about the fragmented OTT delivery landscape because, well, it is really fragmented. To start with that, there are several types of streaming. To begin, we have real-time streaming, which is the traditional streaming that everyone knows and loves, so to speak. And we have Pseudo streaming, which came after that, which is like if you want to use an HTTP server and you like pretend the file is there, but it's not really, it's actually a live stream and you're just sending a file. That's Pseudo streaming. But that wasn't enough. Of course, we came with segmented streaming afterwards, which is the current popular method, where you segment the live stream into several parts and you have an index, and then that index just updates with new parts as they become available. Now, it would be nice if it was this simple and it was just 3 methods, but unfortunately, it's a little bit more complicated. All of these have several methods you can deliver. There's protocols for real-time, for Pseudo, for segmented, and of course, none of these are compatible with each other. So let's get a little bit into that. First of all, there's also players. Besides all the protocols on how you deliver, the players, there's a ton of them. I mean, just in this hall alone, I think there's at least 7 or 8. And they all say they do the same thing, and they all do, and they all work fine. But how do you know what to pick? It's hard. So let's get more into the details. Oh, right, a joke first. Feel free to read this. It just highlights what I just mentioned again. Basically, we should really stop making millions and millions of standards. It would be a really good idea. So, real-time streaming was the first one I mentioned. There's RTMP, which is the well-known protocol that many websites still use as their ingest, but it's not used very often anymore for delivery because Flash is no longer supported in browsers. And so RTMP is no longer used to deliver to browsers. It's a very outdated protocol. It doesn't support HEVC, it doesn't support AV1, there's no Opus, all the newer codecs are not in there. But the protocol itself is very highly supported by encoders you can find here around IBC. They're also highly supported for streaming services. It's something hard to get rid of. Then there's RTSP with RTP at the core, which is an actual standard, unlike RTMP, which is something Adobe invented. RTSP is an actual standard. It supports a lot of things. It's very versatile. You can transport almost anything through it. But it's getting very old. There is an RTSP version 2, which no one supports, but it exists. And version 1 is, well, it is well supported, but only in certain markets, like IP cameras. They have great RTSP support, but most other things not as much. And in browsers, you can forget about it. And then there's something more new for real-time streaming, which is WebRTC, which is the new cool kid on the block, right? And it uses SRTP internally, which is RTP with security added. But internally, it's basically the same thing, except this works in browsers, which is nice. I mean, that means you can actually use it, unlike RTSP. That gives you a bit of an overview of real-time streaming. Well, oh, right. Besides just these protocols, you can also pick between TCP and UDP. Now, TCP is what most of the internet connections use, and it's a reliable method to send things, but because of it being reliable, it's a bit slower. The latency is much higher. Now, UDP is unreliable, but has very low latency. So, depending on what you're trying to do, you might want to use one or the other. And all these protocols, they work with one or more. Like RTMP is always TCP. RTSP can be either, and WebRTC is always UDP. Now, the spec of WebRTC says that it can also be TCP, but I don't know a single browser that supports it, so that's kind of a moot point. Then there's pseudo streaming, which, as I mentioned before, used faked files that are playing while they are downloading. Well, that's a pretty good idea in theory, but there are some downsides that we'll get into later. These are infinite in length and duration, so you can't actually download them. Well, you can, but you end up with a huge file, and you don't know where the beginning and the end is, and it's not very nice. So downside, besides disagreeing on what format you should pseudo stream in, because there's FLV, MP4, OGG, and they all sort of work, but not perfectly. The biggest downside is that you cannot cache these because they are infinite in length, so a proxy server will not store them. And you can't send them to a regular CDN because, well, they're infinite in length, and how do you decide where the beginning and the end is? So that's kind of, well, it's a nice method, but it doesn't work on a scalable system very well. And segmented streaming kind of solves that problem, because when you cut the stream into little files and then add an index at the beginning to say where they are, you can upload those little files to your CDN or cache them in a caching server, and these files will not change, and you just add more and remove others, and the system works. Now, there's some disagreements here too internally between the different formats, like what do we use to index? HLS uses text, but Dash uses XML, and they contain the same info, but in different ways of writing it. And the container format for storing the segments themselves is also not very clear. HLS traditionally uses TS, while Dash uses MP4. Though they're kind of standardizing now on FMP4, but let's not get too detailed here. And the best practices and allowed combinations of what codecs work and which ones do not, do you align the keyframes or not, all of that differs between the protocols as well. So it's kind of hard to reach an agreement there too. The biggest problem with segmented streaming is the high latency, because many players, they want to buffer a couple seconds before segments before they start playing, which means that if your segments are a couple seconds long, your minimal latency is several times a couple seconds, which is not real time in my understanding of the word real time. The compatibility with players and devices is also hard to follow. Like HLS plays fine in iOS, but Dash does not, unless it's FMP4 and you put a different index in front of it, then it plays on newer models, and it's really hard to keep track of what will play where. So that's also a type of fragmentation we have that you need to solve when you want to do all of this. So I kind of lied during the introduction when I just had this slide up, because there's even more fragmentation than just these 4 types. There's also encrypted streaming, and when it comes to encrypted streaming, there's fair play, play ready, white fine, and CEnc, which tries to combine them a little bit. But even within that, they still don't agree on what encryption scheme to use. So that's encrypted. Encryption is fragmented in 2 different levels of fragmentation. And there's reliable transports now, which are getting some popularity, which is for between servers, because you generally don't do this to the end consumer. And there are several options there too. I mean, some of these are companies that have been around for a while. Some are relatively new, from like 1 year ago, half year ago. Some are still in development. Some are being standardized. Some are not. And that also is a type of fragmentation you have to deal with if you're doing OTT. When it comes to the encrypted streaming, there is that common encryption standard, CEnc, common encryption. That's literally what it stands for. But it's not really common, because it standardizes the format and how to transport it. It standardizes on FMP4, it standardizes on where the encryption keys are, etc. But not what type of encryption you use. If you use, they all use a block cipher, but some are counter-based and others are not. So depending on what type of DRM you're using, you might have to use one or the other. So it's not really standardized, but it is. So it's confusing in that level as well. And then with the reliable transports, they are, like I said before, intended for server to server. All of them use these techniques in some combination. Some add a little bit of extra fluff on it. Some remove some of these things. But they all use this at the core. Forward error correction sends extra data with the stream that you can allow to calculate what was missing if something is not arriving at the end. This allows you to not waste any time by asking for retransmits, which is the second one, because you can calculate what was missing, so you don't have to ask and have another round-trip time in between. Now, retransmits are kind of self-explanatory, where the receiving end says, hey, I didn't receive packet number X, can you retransmit it, send me another copy. This wastes time, but eventually you'll get all the data, so you can solve the entire stream properly. And then bonding is something on a different level altogether, where you combine multiple network interfaces, like wireless internet with GSM, and you send data over both, and you hope that the combination of everything will end up arriving. And if you combine all 3 of these, of course, you can get really good reception at the cost of overhead. There's no standardization at all yet on reliable transports. It's very unclear what the advantages and disadvantages are of all these available ones. The ones I listed in the previous slide, well, all of them claim to be the best, all of them claim to be perfect, and all of them claim to be doing some of these things. And there's no real guide as to which you should be using. So lots of fragmentation in OTT. So what do you do to fix all that fragmentation? Well, this is where my marketing kicks in. Right over there is our booth. We are DDVTech, we make MistServer, and it's a technology that you can use to build your own systems on top of. So we kind of give you the engine you can use underneath your own system, and then we help you solve all these problems so that you can focus on what makes your business unique and not have to worry about standardization and what to implement and what the next standard for tomorrow is going to be. We also allow you to auto-select what protocol to use based on what the stream contents are, what device you're trying to play on, what the network conditions are. Basically everything you need to be successful when you're building an OTT platform. Well, that's the end of my presentation. This is where I can take some questions. You can always drop by our booth, like I mentioned. We're right there. Or you can shoot us an email on our generic info address, and we'll help you out and get talking. So, are there any questions?
Do we have any questions from the floor for Jaron?
Well, since I kind of know that no one ever asks any questions, here are some suggestions that you can ask while you drop by our booth. Feel free to come by and ask.
Thank you very much, Jaron. Here's the answer to all the questions you can possibly have on that sort of, on this topic. And as a technological ignoramus myself, I find him really helpful. So thank you to Jaron and to DDVTech and MistServer. We'll have another presentation along in just a few minutes.